Welcome everybody for attending our ICP-AE 13 webinar. And, we are very excited to introduce our first speaker, the Martin Turbot from France. And would like to introduce you first about our speaker. So Martin is a CNRS research scientist working at LMD in Paris. And he did his PhD at LMD in 2018. And he had a short-term postdoctoral visit at the Department of Geophysical Sciences of the University of Chicago and did 3 years of postdoc at the Astronomical Observatory of the University of Geneva. His research work lies at the interface between astrophysics, climate sciences, and geophysics. The main expertise of Dr. Turbot is the development and use of sophisticated numerical atmospheric models to study the climate of terrestrial planets located inside the solar system and outside of the solar system. He also works on spectroscopic measurements in the lab and with telescopes to understand the properties of the atmospheres of telluric planets. So today's talk, the title is shown in this shared screen. Day-night cloud asymmetry inhabits early ocean formation on terrestrial planets. And we are really happy to hear your seminar today. Thank you very much. And please feel free to start, Martin.
Okay, so thanks a lot for this very nice introduction. I'm very pleased and very honored to give this seminar in front of you all. So today I will present you the results of 2 scientific papers. One of them is already published and one of them is in preparation. And these papers present, and this presentation presents, the results of numerical climate model simulations that have been designed to reproduce the conditions of early formations of surface oceans on terrestrial planets, with implications for terrestrial planets in the solar system, Venus, Earth, and Mars, and more generally for exoplanets. So the key question I would like to tackle today in my presentation, at least for the beginning of my presentation, is whether Venus ever had surface liquid water oceans. So today, most of you may know that, okay, so I'm having some issues with my screen. Just a moment. Apologize for that. I'm back.
We see two planets. We see 2 planets with question marks on them.
Yeah, I tried to write something on the screen, but it failed. So let me try that again. If I do that, does it work? Yes, it works. Okay, that will be helpful for the rest of the presentation. Okay, but if I do that, yeah, okay. So today I will keep going to my presentation. So today, most of you may know that Venus, I don't know why it does not suppress. Okay, I should do that. Okay, I will stop using it. So today, Venus is a pretty hell of the world. So it's made of an atmosphere of 90 plus bar of CO2 with surface temperatures that can rise up to 700 Kelvin, so much higher than on Earth and Mars. It is composed of an atmosphere made, or at least composed partially of acid sulfuric clouds that are located near 50-60 kilometers, that are opaque to a wide range of wavelengths. And last but not least, an important point I would like to mention is that we can evaluate the water content today of Venus, and it is quite low compared to the other terrestrial planets, Mars and Earth in the solar system. So basically, if you take all the water from the atmosphere and the clouds of Venus, and you condense everything, so it's a thought experiment, but imagine that you condense everything at the surface, and you have like that a uniform layer of water, then the thickness of this layer of water on Venus will be something like 3 centimeters. Just as a matter of comparison, if you do the same thought experiment on Earth and Mars, you will get something like 30 meters on Mars and 3 kilometers on Earth. So Venus, compared to Mars and Earth, has a very low water reservoir today. But we do have some measurements, some very interesting measurements that tell us that it might not have been the case earlier in the history of Venus. In particular, we have isotopic measurements that were measured with state-of-the-art, ground-based and space-based observations of the ratio between HDO, so this is deuterium, and water, so this is 2 different isotopic version of the same molecule of water. And one of the key discoveries that were made in this paper was that the D/H, so the deuterium over hydrogen ratio, is much higher on Venus than it is on Earth today. And if we make the assumption that Venus and Earth started with similar building blocks, that tells us that a lot of hydrogen actually escaped from Venus compared to Earth. And that means, and this is something that is now widely known now, is that this implies that earlier in the history of Venus, like 3.5, 4 billion years ago, typically, the water reservoir on Venus was much higher than today. And the typical range of estimates is between 4 and 500 meter global equivalent layer of water. So more similar to the present-day reservoir on Mars and on Earth. And so the key question for the past and present ability of Venus is whether this water reservoir, which was much higher in the past than today, was at some point in the history of Venus in the liquid form, potentially forming lakes, rivers, and even global oceans. So the thing is that it's super difficult to test that with observations on Venus. The main reason is that compared to Mars, so on Earth, it's easy, we can probe that directly. We don't need a very sophisticated instrument to see that there are oceans on Earth. On Mars, fortunately, the surface of Mars is quite preserved to erosion through time. And so we can look back quite far in the past, about 3.5, 3.8 billion years ago. And we do see on these ancient terrains some evidence for past liquid water activities. But on Venus, we can't do that because most of the surface of Venus has been widely resurfaced by, in particular, volcanic activities. And so our main hope in terms of observations is to observe some of the, let's say, least eroded terrains, in particular the tessera called Alpha Regio. And this is one of the key scientific goals of these 3 recently selected missions, Da Vinci, Veritas, and Envision, that will, in particular, so that's not, of course, the only science case, but that's one of the big science cases to explore the nature of these terrains and to test the existence of ancient oceans by observations of these terrains. But meanwhile, before we get these observations, the only mean we have to actually tackle these questions is to use theory and modeling, in particular numerical climate modeling. So over the past 50 years or so, there have been a lot of work that have been dedicated to these questions of the past habitability of Venus and the existence of oceans at the surface of Venus, with important contributions from Andrew Ingersoll, first in 1969, and then Jim Pollack, and then Jim Casting, and then more recently, an important work by Japanese scientists led by Keiko Amano, and then Thomas Lebrun, and then Arnaud Salvador. So also these different scientific works that are based on similar approach, one-dimensional numerical climate models, have some discrepancies in the results. One of the key aspects that was highlighted in these papers is that the answer to this question of the past existence of oceans on Venus highly depends on the effect of clouds, whether clouds actually warmed or cooled the atmosphere of early Venus to allow or not the existence of past oceans at the surface of Venus. I think it's highly, very well summarized in this super recent paper that I encourage you to read. It's a very comprehensive paper that was led by Joshua Christensen-Totten that explored the different observational constraints that we have so far and to test the two different scenarios, the one where Venus had oceans and the one where it did not. And one of the key points that is highlighted in the conclusion of this paper is that the likelihood of one or the other of this scenario depends, and this is what I have highlighted here on this paper, on the cloud albedo feedback, so on whether clouds warmed or cooled the atmosphere and the surface of early Venus. And so in that respect, in my personal opinion, one of the key breakthroughs that was obtained, that was performed over the last few years is the work by colleagues from the NASA Goddard Institute that performed some three-dimensional global climate model simulations. I will go back a bit later in my presentation, using the Rookie 3D GCM. So this is a NASA Goddard GCM to compute the following thought experiment. Basically, what they did is that they simulated the atmosphere, hypothetic climate of Venus, of early Venus, by taking basically the Earth today, replacing by the mass and the radius of Venus, putting this hypothetic planet at the location of Venus today, but with the insolation that Venus received like 3.54 billion years ago, at the time that the sun was a bit less luminous than today. So this hypothetic planet simulated in the model have an atmosphere that is close to that of the present-day Earth, and surface ocean that is close to that of present-day Earth oceans. And so they run the model with this configuration, and basically by doing this, they discover that even though this planet received a much higher insolation than today on Earth, the planet actually has pretty mild temperatures. This is summarized here on this plot. And the clouds, a cloud layer, a thick cloud layer that is located mostly at the subsolar point of the planet, so where basically most of the incoming solar radiation is, with the main effect of raising a lot the planetary albedo, because this cloud will reflect a significant fraction of the incoming solar radiation by the sun. So the mechanism work as follows. This is what is summarized in this plot, basically, where you have an idealized planet with here global water oceans that is highlighted by the blue layer here. And basically what's happened is that on a planet, or at least on a slow rotating planet, where most of the incoming solar radiation is located, let's say, on a stable location of the planet. This is illustrated here on this diagram. What happens is that this incoming solar radiation will warm efficiently the surface and the lower part of the atmosphere of this planet, which will have two direct consequences. First of all, it will lead to evaporation of the water ocean in the first layer of the atmosphere of the planet. It will also warm efficiently the first layer on the surface of the planet, which will trigger a process that we call moist convection. Basically, that means that hot, moist air parcels will rise at the subsolar point up in the atmosphere, and by rising, basically, the atmosphere, the air parcels of the atmosphere will actually cool down, but just by thermodynamics, which will produce condensation of the water vapor, because these air parcels are close to saturation in water vapor, which will produce a cloud formation, mostly at the subsolar point. And this process, this atmospheric process, leads, at least on slow rotating planet, to the preferential formation of clouds at the subsolar point. And this is something that has been discussed in the context of Venus, for instance, by Michael Way and colleagues, but this has been observed in a wide range of environment and a wide range of global climate model simulation using different types of 3D GCM. This is, for instance, being observed in the case of tidally locked exoplanets, that is to say, exoplanets with surface liquid water oceans and that have one face in the permanent dark side and one face in the permanent day side. So with a super slow rotation period. This is illustrated in these simulations that were performed with the LMD generic GCM by Jérémy Lecomte a few years ago of a tidally locked planet here orbiting a low mass star. And what you can see that basically the tidal locking, so the fact that the planet is synchronously rotating, force a strong dichotomy in the surface temperature field. This is illustrated here on the left. That formed due to the atmospheric process that I've introduced you before related to the moist convection, the preferential formation of clouds on the day side here, and the preferential, the increase, preferentially of the albedo near the day side. And what is super important with this process is that it is a naturally stabilizing process, because as you increase the insolation that the planet receives, you increase the efficiency of the moist convection at the substellar point. And so you increase the formation of clouds, and so you increase the albedo, and so you basically increase the capability of the planet with the help of clouds to actually cool down through reflecting a significant fraction of the incoming solar radiation. This is also something that we do see, and I would like to mention that because I think it's important on Earth. At the location of the ascending branches of the Hadley cells. So basically, near the equator, you have the two Hadley cells, the north and the south hemisphere, that converge, and you have basically hot, moist air parcel that rise, and that produce the accumulation of clouds in the tropics. And this is called, this is sometimes known as the Earth intertropical convergence zone, and this is one of the critical aspect of the climate system of Earth to understand its evolution through anthropogenic impact in the future. So what I would like to tackle today is whether or not the assumption, so one of the key assumptions that is being made in the simulation is that the planet starts with a global surface oceans, and the simulation actually tests the stability of this global ocean. And so what I would like to discuss today in this presentation, to go a step further, is whether or not a planet like Venus or like Earth or like exoplanets do have the chance in the first place to actually condense from the primordial, let's say, water reservoir, mostly in the form of water vapor, to form the first oceans that can later on live or exist as surface liquid water oceans. I think this is nicely illustrated in this diagram that was made by Tim Lichtenberg, and that basically summarizes the question, which is at the end of the magma ocean phase, at the time that most of the water is in the form of the gas phase in the atmosphere, does the water condense on the surface because the planet can cool enough for this water to condense and form the first oceans, or is the planet too hot to actually condense the water, and so that ocean formation is prevented? So to tackle these questions, we basically design three-dimensional climate model simulations to reproduce the conditions of a planet at the end of the magma ocean phase, where water vapor was the main dominant component of the atmosphere of a telluric planet. And so we looked at the conditions required or necessary for this water to actually condense to the surface. So for that, we used a 3D global climate model that is called the LMD generic GCM, and that is being now developed for decades in France, mostly in France. And that is made of a number of atmospheric climate components to reproduce as close as possible from the reality a wide range of planetary atmospheres. So this process that I include in the model range from the dynamical equations that simulate the large-scale transport of air parcels, the radiative transfer in the gas, in the atmosphere, and in the clouds, and with the surface, exchange with the surface and the atmosphere, as well as the effect and the formation of clouds and the change of phase of the different constituents, in particular in that situation of water vapor in the atmosphere. So this model is a huge community effort that is being led now by tens and possibly hundreds of scientists for really decades. I've put here some of the key persons that have contributed a lot in the recent years to the development of the LMD generic GCM. And so today, the result I will present you really rely on the works of the continuous work of all these people through the past 40 years or so of work together. One of the key strengths of this model that I would like to emphasize is that it has been widely tested on a lot of different planetary atmospheres in the solar system, in particular on Earth. So the model, at least the Earth version of the model, is part of the IPCC intercomparison project. We also have applied the model to Mars and Venus, where the Mars and Venus version of the model is now being used as a reference to compare to observation, in particular, that have been made with space observations. We have the Mars climate database and the Venus climate database. And we also have been using the model. I have put here a number of references that you can have a look at if you want to know more for different terrestrial atmosphere, ranging from the cold objects such as Pluto, Triton, and Titan, but also the giant planets such as Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. We have also applied, and this is what I will present you today, the model to study the paleoclimates of solar system planets. And this is, for instance, one of the experiments that we did. And I'm going back to what I was presenting before, where we basically set up the GCM, so the global climate model, the 3D global climate model simulation. You have an illustration here on the left with the surface temperature field and the typical cloud layer. A situation here of a young terrestrial planet with an atmosphere that is being dominated by water vapor in composition. So to simulate that kind of very specific composition, we had to adapt the model in a number of aspects. In particular, we had to adapt the spectroscopy. We had to adapt the convection, and we have to adapt the convergence, the numerical convergence scheme of the simulations to deal with the fact that these atmospheres are water vapor dominated, which basically affect a lot the time that it takes for the atmosphere to actually reach equilibrium, top of atmosphere equilibrium. So I will now jump straight to the results. So one of the key results that we discovered by doing this kind of simulation is that young terrestrial planets that are being dominated in composition by water vapor tend to form, and this is illustrated in this plot showing you the surface temperature and the cloud distribution. They tend to form clouds preferentially on night side. This is what you see on the right, where basically on the day side, where the surface temperature is maximum, you have almost no clouds. This is the brown region, and on the night side and at the poles, the white region, the atmosphere is actually covered by clouds. So this is the opposite result of what I was presenting you so far in the simulations of early Venus. This is a behavior that we observed in all the simulations that we have performed, whether we assume what I would call the fast rotator, so the typical rotation of the present the Earth, or a slow rotator, the typical rotation of Venus. So in this plot, you see the cloud, the integrated cloud column distribution with in this region, for instance, maximum of clouds, so basically on the night side and at the poles, and at the subsolar point, the absence of clouds. And you see that this is something that seems robust, and that is actually robust in all the simulation that we've done. So we vary the number of parameters, the rotation rate, the insolation, the assumption of the microphysics, the partial pressure of water and CO2, and we do observe the similar behavior in all the simulation we've done. So the mechanism that we have identified for preferential formation of night side clouds work as follows. So basically in these simulations, the key difference with the simulation I've presented you before in the simulations of NASA GISS, so NASA Goddard Rocky 3D, is that water vapor is not the dominant gas of the atmosphere. This is what you see on the right plot, where you have basically a vertical mixing ratio plot that shows you the water vapor distribution in a planet that has ocean, so that has ocean at the surface, and a planet that starts with all the water reservoir in the atmosphere. And you see that there is a strong difference between the two by order, typically 6, 7, 8 orders of magnitude. The key difference is that in these simulations where water vapor is dominant in red, you have a strong direct absorption of solar radiation by water vapor, because water is a super efficient absorbent, in particular in the near infrared wavelength. The main consequence of that is that this atmosphere, this is illustrated on the left part of the plot, absorb most of the flux pretty high in the atmosphere, actually, in the upper troposphere, in the stratosphere. Direct effect of that is that the strong warming actually warms the atmosphere above the condensation temperature of water, so that kills moist convection, that kills cloud formation at the subsolar point of the planet. Instead, as the air parcels are transported by large-scale circulation from the day side to the night side, so this is illustrated in this plot, the water vapor, which is not only a good absorbent, but is also a good emitter, will strongly emit thermal infrared radiation to space, so that will cool efficiently the stratosphere, and that will lead through condensation, through large-scale condensation, to the formation of clouds, mostly at the poles and on the night side of the planet. Since you are basically forming clouds, mostly in the stratosphere and on the night side, while before the clouds in the simulation of microwave are mostly formed at the subsolar point and in the troposphere. The main consequence of that is that because you have almost no clouds on the day side and a lot of clouds at the pole and on the night side, that means that the planet has actually a super low albedo. And so that means most of the incoming solar radiation is actually used to warm the planetary atmosphere. The other aspect is that the presence of clouds on the night side and in the stratosphere actually produce a super strong greenhouse effect on the planet. And I think this is nicely illustrated by this series of plots that shows you on the top row the presence, the distribution of water clouds, and on the bottom row where most of the radiation to space is emitted. And you see that in all the simulation that basically the thermal emission to space is anti-correlated with the presence of clouds. Clouds on the night side are blocking thermal radiation and are actually playing a super strong greenhouse effect. Something I would like to mention is that basically, compared to the simulation that were performed before, in the case where oceans are at the surface, we have kind of the two extreme situations where clouds can have a maximum cooling effect or maximum warming effect. If you were to imagine just a thought experiment of where you should put the clouds on a planetary atmosphere to maximize their cooling, then if you think about this experiment, you should think about putting the clouds in the troposphere and at the subsolar point, because this is where they will reflect most of the incoming solar radiation while minimizing the greenhouse effect of clouds. This is what you have in the initial simulations that were presented in the work of Michael Webb, for instance. Now, if you think about what could be the optimal configuration where you should put the clouds to maximize the warming in the planetary atmosphere, then you should actually put them mostly at the poles and on the night side where you have almost no incoming solar radiation, and you should put them high up in the atmosphere because this is where the clouds will act as the most efficient greenhouse effect, as the most efficient greenhouse effect. And so you see that these two kind of simulations, these two kind of clouds that naturally appears in these two n-number simulations are like kind of the two most extreme configuration that you could think of in terms of cooling or warming of a planetary atmosphere. And the main direct consequence is the following. Imagine that you make the following thought experiment. So let's do it first in the context of Venus, of simulating, and this is the original experiment of Michael Way and colleagues, an early Venus hypothetical planet with oceans. You start with a planet at low insolation. Okay, the thought experiment is the following. Then you compute with the GCM the surface temperature on the planet, and you get the blue point here that is highlighted with my mouse, okay? Now you will increase the incoming solar radiation on the planet until, okay, and this is what you go when you go on the right of this plot, you reach a certain threshold that is called the runaway greenhouse effect, at which suddenly, because the planet can't hold with the super high insolation, the planet will go in runaway and all the oceans will evaporate into the atmosphere. And you see that this evaporation occurs quite high in terms of insolation because the clouds like push back because they are located mostly at the subsolar point, the insolation at which a planet can sustain surface liquid water oceans. Let's now make a different thought experiment, and this is what corresponds to the results, the new results I have presented you in the last couple of minutes, where you basically make a different thought experiment where you start with a planet with most of the water reservoir in the atmosphere at high insolation. Okay, this is this plot that you see here. And then you play the opposite game where you basically reduce the incoming solar radiation until you reach the insolation at which the water vapor suddenly starts to condense at the surface. Something super interesting that you can see here is that for a given insolation here on Venus, there are basically two possible stability states, whether you start with the water at the surface or in the atmosphere. And this is due to the extremely opposite effect of clouds, where clouds here are warming the planet and clouds here are actually cooling the planet. This has strong implications for the evolution of Venus in the past, in particular, because Venus in the past received at the beginning, let's say, at the end of the magma ocean phase, expected magma ocean phase of Venus, an insolation that is something about that. And so that means that because the planet started hot and with most of the water reservoir in the atmosphere, that means the planet should have crossed the red branch before crossing the blue branch. And that means, in other words, that Venus, even though in theory could have had surface liquid ocean, should never have been able to condense them and should never have been able to have actually surface liquid water oceans because it was never able to condense them. We did some sensitivity experiments to test the robustness of the simulations. First of all, by playing a bit with the amount of water vapor in the atmospheres. So we played basically with partial pressure of water vapor between 1 bar and 100 bar of water, which typically represents a range of between 10 and 1,000 meter global equivalent layer, which roughly encompass the range of water content expected from the isotopic measurements that I've introduced you earlier in my presentation. And the results stay the same, the planet trapped in the red branch. We also played with other gases. In particular, we implemented CO2 in the atmosphere, and again, the planet stayed trapped in the same branch of simulations. So basically, if I summarize, okay, based on these simulations, although Venus' main principle sustained some surface liquid water ocean, it was never able to have ocean because it was never able to condense oceans. Okay, so now that we have the simulation, we can apply them to the case of Earth. And this is the exact same diagram that was performed in the context of Earth. So you see that the blue branch extends to much lower insolation. The reason is that the Earth is fast rotating, so doesn't have the capability to stabilize through this subsolar cloud cover, the persistence of oceans at large insolation. While, and this is a key result of these simulations, in the red branch, we still have, let's say, huge stability of this region of parameters at pretty low insolations. You recover the B-stability between the red branch and the blue branch, which means the Earth, and this is a novelty of this work, don't have two, but maybe three stability states. The present-day Earth with global oceans, mostly deglaciated, the snowball Earth with almost fully glaciated planets, and this is what we propose, the steam Earth, a stability state at the insolation of Earth today, where all the oceans will be vaporized in the atmosphere. In other words, if you make a crazy experiment where you suddenly vaporize the oceans on Earth into the atmosphere, the prediction of this simulation is that it should remain stable. Another implication of this result is that you see in this diagram that about 4+ billion years ago, at the time we do expect that the Earth ocean formed through condensation, the incoming solar radiation on Earth was lower than this condensation limit, which is, I mean, fully consistent with the fact that we do see oceans on Earth. We could make the same experiment on Mars and we will get the same result. But the key aspect I would like to mention is that you see that if the solar luminosity would have been constant through time, that is to say, if the insolation on Earth would have been the same 4+ billion years ago than today, the prediction of this model, of this simulation, is that the Earth will not have been able to condense ocean. In other words, what we are claiming with this simulation is that the faint young sun, which has long been known as a paradox for the habitability of the Earth, may in fact have been a kind of opportunity to form the first oceans on Earth through condensation in the first place. Last but not least, I would like to take a couple of minutes now to discuss these results, and this is some work that is now in preparation in the context of exoplanets. So I put in this slide similar results that were obtained in the context of tidally locked planet around an early M-type star. So that is a slow rotating planet around a low mass star. You basically see the same kind of two branches, the cold branch with a deglaciated ocean and the red branch with oceans that are fully vaporized in the atmosphere. So one of the results in preparation here is that we do see the exact same behavior in terms of distability and behavior in terms of cloud distributions for all types, for planets orbiting all types of main sequence stars, from solar type stars down to low mass stars. So here, this is the case of an early M-type star, but we do see the same results in the simulations for planets orbiting like Proxima Centauri type of star or TRAPPIST-1, for instance, type of star. And I will try to show you now in the next couple of slides what are the consequences for our understanding of the potential habitability of exoplanets. On this diagram, I will show you a number of known planets as a function of the stellar effective temperature of the host star around which the planets are orbiting. So here, for instance, for Venus and Earth, this is the Sun, as a function on the x-axis of the solar or stellar flux that this planet receives. So this is the Venus and Earth. This is early Venus and early Earth, about 4+ billion years ago, at the time the planets are expected to have formed or not their first oceans. At least this is the case for Earth, probably not for Venus. We don't know yet. And now I'm putting all the known, so I think this is the most up-to-date list of exoplanets, known exoplanets that lie on this diagram and that have the properties to have a radius that is less than 1.6 times that of the Earth, and a mass that is less than 5 times the mass of the Earth. In other words, this is all the exoplanets and planets that are believed to be in the category of telluric planets, so that are more comparable to solar system telluric planets. I would like to show you some results of calculation that were obtained a few years ago, now in particular first by Jim Castling and more recently by Ravi Kopparapu, that shows you basically lines where a planet have the capability or do not have the capability to hold a surface liquid water ocean. So if you are in this blue region that is known often as the habitable zone, even though this I know this naming is sometimes controversial, this zone roughly defines the results of a calculation where Ravi Kopparapu and colleagues assumed a planet with surface liquid water ocean and looked at how far can they put the planet before it freezes, or how far or how close to the sun or a star the planet can go before fully evaporating. And so if you are in these regions, that means that you could potentially have surface liquid water ocean. This red branch here shows two different calculations that were obtained in the context of the future of the Earth, and that shows you the insolation at which we do expect this runaway greenhouse effect to occur in 3D. So there are more subtle effects that are accounted for fast rotator planet and for slow rotator planet. You see that for slow rotator planets, and this is exactly what I have presented to you earlier in my presentation. Due to the slow rotation, you have a preferential accumulation of clouds on the day side, which tends to cool efficiently the planet, and so which tend to strongly extend the insolation at which a planet can actually sustain surface liquid water ocean. So these calculations that have been performed by Michael Way and Tony Del Genio here in the context of Venus and Earth, so in the context of the sun as being the star, but they have been also discussed in the context of and explored with the 3D numerical simulation, in the context of different types of exoplanet by Ravi Koparapu and colleagues with a different model. Here, the Rocky 3D model. And you see that matches quite well, basically, all the planets that are located in this new blue region due to the stabilizing effect of subsolar convective clouds, then can actually extend the range of orbital distances at which a planet can have oceans to much closer to the star than what was thought earlier. And now that I've introduced the context for exoplanet, I want to show you how the results of these new simulations that account for, in the conditions, the capability of a planet not only to maintain ocean, but to form ocean in the first place. Basically, in the red points that you see here, this is the conditions that I've discussed earlier in my presentation, where we basically started with a planet, Earth and Venus, with most of the water reservoir in the atmosphere. And we looked at the minimum insolation at which this water reservoir will condense to form the first ocean. And so this is basically typical insolation of the condensation. We extended the calculations to different types of stars, K-star, early M-type star, Proxima, and TRAPPIST-1-like star. And this is the result that we get. So we can roughly fit a line that we define as the water condensation limit. And so this blue region that you see here show you kind of revised version of the so-called habitable zone, in which we include as a condition the capability of a planet to form through condensation the first oceans on the planet. And to go a step further in the thought experiment, what matters is not the insolation that the planet receives today, but the insolation that the planet receives at the end of the magma ocean phase. So if you account for the way the different stars, the stellar luminosity evolve through time, you can actually shift this red branch of solution to this new one that accounts for the fact in particular that early late M-type stars form with a higher luminosity than they have today, while the luminosity of massive stars like the sun tend to increase through time, and so was less luminous in the past. So this has a strong implication for in terms of let's say zone that actually permits the existence of surface liquid water oceans on exoplanets. You see that, for instance, all these planets that you see here can be within or outside this limit, depending on whether we account for the capability of these planets to actually condense their first oceans. Okay, so I can now reach straight to the conclusion of this presentation. Basically, I've shown that forming oceans is more difficult than keeping them liquid, and because of two different opposite effects of clouds. So planets that have oceans have clouds mostly located on the day side, which tends to cool and stabilize oceans, while clouds that are located on the night side, preferentially, they tend to actually warm the planet. And I think a nice analogy for you to remember this very specific type of clouds is this Japanese pastries that are known as mochi, where basically you have like a day side or mochi that is depleted of clouds or sticky rice, and on the night side a full thick cloud layer that is made of sticky rice in the mochi. I think it's a nice analogy to kind of think about what this kind of planets might actually look like. in the context of Venus, the prediction of this model is that Venus was unable to actually condense oceans. So Venus in this simulation did not have the capability to be habitable in the past. In the context of Earth, this simulation showed that the faint young sun, which has long been seen as a paradox, may in fact also have been an opportunity for the appearance of life on Earth. We are also showing that there might be a third new stability state for the Earth that we call the steam Earth state, with all the oceans evaporated into the atmosphere. And last but not least, this effect has strong consequences for the extent of the habitable zone for planets and exoplanets around all types of main sequence stars. And before I finish my presentation, I just would like to add a few more slides to give you food for thoughts, and in particular on how could we test these modeling results with observations with more modeling results. So there are basically three different prospects I would like to highlight. The first one is one of the, let's say, healthy practice in the modeling community is to check whether the same mechanism appear or not in other 3D global climate models. So I expect in the next couple of years that the Uber model will try to reproduce these simulations to see if this cloud feedback appear to be robust. I just would like to highlight the fact that we had some discussions with Eric Wolf, with the main developer of the ExoCam GCM, one of the leading exoplanet GCM in the field. Where basically looked at experiments of planets and exoplanets covered with oceans, and that goes into this runaway greenhouse effect, where basically you are evolving from a planet with oceans at the surface that are evaporating sharply into the atmosphere. And what is interesting is that in these simulations, it does observe a transition in the cloud behavior, with clouds at the beginning of the simulation being mostly located on the day side and clouds evolving, and this is illustrated with this plot, progressively on the night side, mostly in the upper atmosphere. This is the day side in blue and the night side with the clouds, the cloud distribution, map of the cloud distribution. The second, of course, prospect to test these results is through direct observations of Venus. So luckily, we have at least 3 space missions that have been recently selected, and with one of the main key science goal will be to actually test the existence of past oceans or lakes or rivers at the surface of Venus, in particular by targeting the tessera regions of the surface of Venus. In particular, just to give you an example, the Da Vinci mission will target the Alpha Regio that I've mentioned, and will try to look for signatures with different instruments that are mounted, in particular by testing the thermal emission wavelength distribution, the nature of the surface of these terrains. And last but not least, I would like to, and this is one of my favorite pathway to actually test that kind of result, to use exoplanets. Fortunately, and you may have heard about it, the James Webb has been successfully launched and is now being like almost fully deployed. All the news are good so far, and so we do expect all the planned observations to take place in the coming year, coming 2 years. And among the scientific observation, we'll have in particular observations of telluric planets and mini Neptunes, some of them being the TRAPPIST-1 planets. And we did some simulations for these planets, here TRAPPIST-1b, CD, in which we do see the exact same cloud feedback. This is illustrated in this plot that shows you for TRAPPIST-1b, CD, the cloud distribution. You see that they are mostly located, depending on the insolation, on the day side, and almost always no clouds on the day side, so the same strong dichotomy. And so we are now looking deeply with the help of Thomas Fauché, NASA Goddard, the different possible transit spectra signature of the specific distribution of clouds, and we believe that with the different types of observation that we have, in particular for TRAPPIST-1b, in terms of thermal emission and transit spectral observation, observations, the capability to test that kind of atmospheric process at play let's say in a natural laboratory to test this specific atmospheric process to learn more about let's say the process that govern the evolution of planet with potential application, of course, to the climate evolution of terrestrial planets. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to take any question if you have.
Thank you so much, Martin Thirouet, for your very interesting presentation. So yes, we have a couple of minutes. I think we can go a little bit over the hour. I mean, this is the whole point of this seminar, of this webinar, is that it is really relaxed and we don't, need to be too strict on everything. I see one hand. Sushil is raising a hand, and I allow Sushil to talk. So Sushil, if you unmute yourself, you can talk.
Thank you, Martin. Extremely interesting seminar. I have a comment and a question. First, a question, which is really to do with your last slide about testing the ideas with the missions that are coming up, and in particular, Da Vinci. And I say Da Vinci because I am part of it. And maybe someone asked you that question last week, but I was away at that time. The question I have is there any way of testing the two competing hypotheses, yours and Wei and Del Genio's, with the very exquisite measurements of the D2H isotopic ratio as a function of altitude that Da Vinci is going to carry out from above the cloud tops all the way down to the surface, and possibly also in the boundary layer? And there are other measurements I can talk about, but that's in particular quite relevant to this. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my thought on that, so I did not, thought like extremely deeply about this question, but I mean, so far I do not see easy way to test it through using like vertically resolved D/H ratio measurements, because from what I understand, like the two scenario, at least if you are using only the D/H measurements, are fully consistent with the measurement that you could make, because basically maybe one of the big difference between the scenario, is the timing at which the escape of the preferential escape of the deuterium over the hydrogen should have occurred. So in the Wei and the Genio hypothesis, where the planet Venus might have had oceans quite late in the history of the planet, we do expect that most of the atmospheric escape of water should have occurred quite late in the history of Venus, while in the scenario where Venus would have never been able to form ocean, I would expect that the escape occurred quite early in the evolution of the atmosphere of Venus. But I do not see easy way to test only with this specific measurement, let's say the timing at which the water escaped. And so from what I understand, I just don't know how you can use this measurement I don't think it's the most promising, at least using these measurements alone to test this hypothesis.
The timing is important because that could actually impact the actual D2H ratio, which even now we don't know very well, because early in the history of Venus, the escape processes were most likely quite different, other than the Jeans escape that we assume and take it constant as a function of time. Because solar wind, as we know from Maven observations, the solar wind effect works for hydrogen as well. Combining those results with the geology results, like the Alpha Regio 3D imaging that Da Vinci is going to do, and other missions also going to do a great job. I think that might help us eventually. My comment really had to do with the early history of Venus, and that's another set of measurements that Da Vinci is going to emphasize, is to try and understand what the really early on, the formation of Venus and the early history, and that has to do with the isotopic ratios. Well, first the abundance of xenon and the isotopic ratios of xenon and other noble gases. So that's another set of measurements that would be helpful in trying to understand this. But again, thanks very much. I really enjoyed your seminar.
Thanks a lot for your question and comment. Yeah, I mean, if Da Vinci or one of the other missions detect like direct evidence, for instance, of through emissivity measurements that the surface of Alpha Regio is like the same that in nature than the one that at the bottom of the Earth ocean, then of course that will be like smoking gun evidence to show that Venus had oceans, and that will be the evidence that the scenario that I've presented you today is wrong and that we missed something in the process. Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. There is one question in the Q&A box, but from Longkang. But perhaps, Longkang, would you like to speak your question? I can allow you to talk if you want to unmute yourself, or otherwise I can read it. No, then I will read the question. So, hello, I'm Longkang. This is an interesting study. I have a question. How much ocean do you think is needed to evaporate to drive the Earth to develop towards the new team steady state? Thank you.
That's a tricky question. I don't know what Longkang had in mind. But yeah, that's a tricky question. And you may ask, okay, in the distant future of Earth, like, is there like a critical, let's say, insolation at which you do expect to transition from one state to the other? I would suspect that this transition will occur at pretty high water vapor mixing ratio. The reason is that on Earth, we have the chance to have nitrogen and oxygen as two, we call them background, like inactive, mostly inactive radiative gases that have the property to significantly increase the thermal radiation to space compared to an hypothetical planet that did not have these two gases. This is something that has, for instance, been widely explored in a recent paper by Guillaume Chavreau, and that is available on the archive or Astronomy and Astrophysics. This is also something that has been explored by Ramses Ramirez on a series of recent papers looking at the effect of adding CO2 and nitrogen in the atmosphere of the Earth. And basically, so when you neglect the effect of clouds, basically, probably this transition occurs at relatively large water vapor mixing ratio. By large, I mean something like maybe a few bar of water vapor or so, at least for the Earth. With Guillaume Chavreau, he's working as a PhD student with us at the Geneva University. We are currently performing some new calculations where we are basically trying to explore these questions in more details, where we basically start with simulations similar in terms of design to the simulations of Michael Way and Jeremy Lecomte a few years ago, where we start with a planet like Earth and Venus, and then we put it closer and closer to the sun. And then there is a given point or given threshold in terms of water vapor at which we try to see whether we do observe this cloud transition between the day side and the night side. And so I expect from based on this preliminary simulation that the transition should occur at the typical order of magnitude of a few bar of water vapor or so. But this is still preliminary work, and this will have also to be tested with different types of model. I should highlight, though, that there are some models. In particular, there have been some work that was performed a few years ago by Max Popp, 2016, I think, Nature Geoscience paper, where he showed that there might be also some intermediate states before reaching this steam state with all the oceans vaporized in the atmosphere that I think Max called a moist greenhouse state or something like that. Moist or hot moist states, where he basically found in some of the simulations that there might be like an intermediate stability state with global ocean that is being like present at the surface, but the atmosphere at the same time is hot and quite moist, so quite enriched in water vapor. And so we are re-exploring that with a different model to see if this state is actually stable or should transition at some critical water vapor threshold to the steam state. But this is still, I think this is still a work in progress to give a more precise answer to this question.
Okay, thank you, Martin. I hope that answers your question, Longkang.
Maybe I can just add
yes.
another thought that is related to that. One of the key things that we did not mention in this paper and that I think might be interesting to think about is that there are a few, let's say, epochs in the history of the Earth. For instance, after the big impact that occurred early on in the history of Earth, where, like, at least episodically, you might expect that some of the impact may have like heated the surface and atmosphere of Mars, may have injected some water vapor, and so that's something also that might be interesting to look at in this context, whether or not this big impact could have been related to, could have produced, in theory, so probably not, because we have evidence that Earth had surface equal water ocean for 4+ billion years ago, but that's something that we should also think about in the context of the evolution of Earth, at least as a constraint in the past, in the very ancient history, in terms of the cratering records for the Earth.
Okay, very good. And I think we can take one more question, and then might call this go to the end. So, Yanjo, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question, and Martin, this was a really exciting work, and I really enjoyed your paper and talk today. And my question actually comes from somehow basic part. So, so the source of water, okay, it's as far as I understand that the source of the water can be from internal of the planetary body, or it can be from outside of the planetary body, like a comet, for example. So I wonder that what would be then such a case implications if water comes from outside the planet, but how it would affect, and what would be your expectations?
Yeah, that's an important question. So basically, in these simulations, we made the implicit assumption that at least some, maybe not all, but some of the water was present, let's say, at the end of the magma ocean phase in the atmosphere of Venus and Earth. And so I know that this is debated of what is the fraction that comes from like the formation phase or from like later stages through like delivery of comets or asteroids. So basically, that's kind of what we tried also to encompass by doing this, and I will go back to this plot where we basically did some sensitive experiment where we varied the water reservoir that was present in the atmosphere of Venus. So this sensitive experiment, they were designed not only to kind of tackle the range of reservoir that was allowed by the D/H ratio, but also to allow for the fact that not all the water may have been delivered, may have been present at the beginning of the history of Venus. So basically, the simulation, they show that at least down to 1 bar, we didn't make simulation lower, but because we had to select, the range of parameters. These are quite expensive simulation in terms of computational time. We do observe that the early Venus planet stays trapped in the steam, let's say, stability state. And so based on this range of results, we thought that as soon as water vapor is present in a significant fraction at the beginning, let's say at the end of the magma ocean phase, or at the timing where water could start to condense, then cloud formation should prevent, at least in the simulations, the formation by condensation of oceans. Something that could have happened though, and this is a scenario that could reconcile in some way the simulation that I have presented and the simulations that Michael Way and Todi Del Genio have done, is that so Venus could have suffered from a magma ocean phase where at the end, so water and other gases might have been present in the atmosphere. Water may have not condensed, but what might have happened at the time is that this water may have been lost through the atmosphere, to space, through a number of atmospheric escape processes, and CO2 and other gases may have also escaped to space. And so if I go on this scenario, then that means that at some point, Venus would have completely get rid of this atmosphere. And so Venus would have been kind of or close to an airless planet. And then you will have later on some outgassing or some delivery through comets and asteroids, which could have, let's say in a later stage, reform a new atmosphere that may have led to the condensation of the water. And so this scenario in which water cannot condense after the post-magma ocean state, but could allow some existence of liquid water ocean, but that requires, I believe, that the atmosphere of Venus get, let's say, completely eroded at some point in the very early history of Venus. I don't know if you followed if this sophisticated scenario, if you understood the scenario that I want to mention, or
Yonjo?
Yeah, that sounds quite interesting. And actually, I know it's a very difficult question to constrain some conditions. And so that I will just shape a bit my question, like some following up questions. And maybe I do not understand the detailed parts of the possible configurations of modeling, but wonder that if Venus didn't have enough water, very small, and after a certain time, when it formed surface, after that, if we got some water, I mean that if it was some certain event occurred after forming solid surface, then would it be possible to cause somehow different result from the paper? I mean that.
I understand. So I believe we did not compute the simulation in the way you present it. So we did kind of by computing like different range of partial pressure of water and CO2, we kind of did different snapshots of what the early Venus atmosphere may have looked like at the time, but we do not, of course, capture the entire possibilities of states and of gases that might have been present. But if you think about the set of situations where water vapor would have been a very minor gas, and so but you're basically saying, if I understand correctly, maybe Venus had a very low water reservoir and then it was brought later and then it condensed straight. I don't think that's that easy, because if you decrease the water reservoir of Venus, so let's say if you are looking at a hypothetical Venus with much less than a bar of water vapor, what happens is that, okay, you have less water vapor in the atmosphere, so you have less greenhouse effect. So you might think, okay, the surface temperature will get lower, and that could probably what would happen.
Right.
And so that might facilitate the condensation of water. But what will happen also is that if you decrease the partial pressure of water, you actually decrease the condensation temperature that is required to actually condense this water, just because of the Clausius-Clapeyron law that tells you that the condensation temperature depends on the partial pressure. The higher the partial pressure, the higher the temperature of condensation is, and the lower the partial pressure here, the lower is the condensation temperature of the water. And basically, if you are, for instance, at 6 millibar of water vapor, then the condensation temperature is something like 270 K. And so as soon as you have a bit of CO2 or other gases in the atmosphere, which might have been expected at the time, unless you get completely rid of the atmosphere. That was why I made the point of, I believe that in this scenario, you need at some point in the course of the story of Venus to get completely rid of the atmosphere of Venus. Unless you don't have that, I suspect, but we did not model it. I think this is something that needs to be done, that the residual greenhouse effect of CO2, CO, hydrogen, or any other greenhouse gas that might have been present at the time would, in the particular limit where water vapor is a trace gas, would have prevented the water vapor to actually reach the condensation temperature of water. I mean, this needs to be tested because there might be subtlety, like, okay, the planet are free, so maybe at the cold point, it might be easier, for instance, to condense on the night side of the planet. So there are subtleties like that should be tested at some point. But I don't think it's that easy. I mean, I don't think it's easy to condense ocean and to form oceans that way either.
Yeah, thank you so much.